Morning light slid through the high courthouse windows in narrow, pale strips that never quite warmed the room. The November air pressed against the glass outside, dull and colorless, while inside the courtroom everything smelled faintly of disinfectant, old paper, and faint traces of burnt coffee. Time behaved differently in places like this. It slowed down. It thickened. It waited. Wooden benches creaked softly as people adjusted their coats, shifted their weight, whispered last-minute reassurances to themselves. A nervous cough echoed too loudly near the back. Someone dropped their keys. Somewhere, a phone vibrated once and was immediately silenced. This was supposed to be another ordinary morning. Minor citations, tired apologies, soft sentences, brief disappointments. It never is. The bailiff called for order exactly at 9:11 a.m. The room rose in uneven rhythm. Shoes scraped across tile. A purse slipped from one shoulder and was caught just in time. Everyone sat again as the judge took his place on the bench. The movement was automatic, rehearsed over thousands of mornings. It felt less like respect and more like muscle memory. The clerk began moving through the docket with practiced speed. A broken tail light, a parking violation, an expired registration. Names rose and fell. Defendants shuffled forward and backward. Tickets were explained. Fines were adjusted. It was all painfully routine. Then her finger paused. She looked up once. Her voice changed. Case number T19-88241, City versus Yusuf Hamdan. Original charge: failure to yield at a marked crosswalk, failure to comply with lawful command. Original court date filed September 2019. Case reopened for internal review. A faint ripple moved through the gallery. Most people barely reacted. Old cases being reopened sounded like paperwork, like a filing error, like something that would be resolved with a quick signature so the court could move on. At the defense table, a man stood slowly. Yusuf Hamdan was 60 years old. His dark suit had been carefully pressed, but it showed its age at the seams. A faint polish remained on his shoes, though the shine had dulled with years of use. His posture was upright in the way men stand when they have carried responsibility for decades without complaint. His hands did not shake. Only his eyes betrayed a quiet, unspoken tension. Behind him, in the second row of the gallery, a young woman rose as well. Her name was Samira. Today she was 21. 3 years ago she had been 18. Her fingers trembled as she stood. She kept her gaze lowered at first, staring at the neat pattern of scuffed wood beneath her shoes. Her breathing was shallow, measured, like she was afraid the wrong breath might unravel her completely. The judge lifted his eyes. "Good morning, sir," he said evenly. "Do you understand why this case has been reopened?" Yusuf nodded. "They told me an old matter had been reviewed again, Your Honor." "That's correct." The clerk returned to the file. On September 22, 2019, at approximately 9:06 p.m., Officer Daniel Price initiated a pedestrian safety stop near the intersection of Ridgeway and Pine. The defendant allegedly failed to yield at a marked crosswalk and did not immediately comply with verbal commands. Officer noted communication difficulty and issued citations for obstruction and unsafe operation. The judge's pen stopped moving. The pause was subtle, almost invisible, but the room felt it. "Officer Price," the judge said, lifting his head, "are you present?" A uniformed officer rose from the right side of the courtroom, mid-40s, broad chest, the posture of someone trained to project control even when unsure. "Yes, Your Honor." "You conducted this stop?" "Yes." "Time of day?" "Night." "Lighting conditions?" "Poor." "Traffic flow?" "Moderate to heavy." The judge nodded once, absorbing each word. "And the interpreter used during the encounter?" The officer hesitated. "Not long. Just long enough." The defendant's daughter. A faint tension spread through the room like an invisible static charge. "How old was she at the time?" 18. "Was she a certified interpreter?" "No, Your Honor." The judge did not respond immediately. He flipped several pages in the file slowly, then stopped. Something had caught his attention. Carefully, deliberately, he slid a thin blue envelope free from the inner fold of the case record. It looked out of place. Too personal, too human. This, the judge said, turning it in his hand, does not belong in an administrative file. What is it? The clerk leaned forward, squinting. That was discovered during an internal audit of inactive citations, Your Honor. It appears to be a handwritten letter that was stapled to the folder but never entered into evidence. The envelope's corners were soft with age. On the front, in neat, hesitant handwriting, a faded date remained visible. September 23rd, 2019. The judge lifted his eyes toward the gallery. Samira, he asked gently, did you write this? Her throat tightened. For a moment, nothing came out. Then she nodded. Yes. The judge broke the seal, folded the paper open, and began to read aloud. Dear Sir, I am writing because I do not know how else to say this. I am scared to give this letter to anyone at the station. I am scared to mail it because my father might see it and feel ashamed. But I cannot carry this feeling anymore without saying something. Last night my father was stopped by a police officer. The officer spoke very fast and very loud. My father does not understand English when people are angry. He asked me to translate. I tried to explain to the officer that my father was confused, not disobedient. But the officer kept repeating the commands louder instead of slower. When the officer got louder, my father became more afraid. When my father became more afraid, I became more afraid. I felt like I was standing in the middle of two storms. I felt like if I said one word wrong, everything could fall apart. I am only 18 years old. I am not trained to understand legal words. I am not trained to handle police encounters. I am just his daughter. But at that moment, I felt like I was responsible for his safety and his future at the same time. When we got home, my hands would not stop shaking. My father hugged me and said I did well, but I feel like I did not. I feel like fear made my voice weak. I feel like one wrong word could have taken my father from me. Please do not make me do this again. I want to be his daughter, not his interpreter. Respectfully, S. The last word fell into complete silence. 5 seconds passed. No one moved. 7. The officer's gaze drifted downward. 10. Samira pressed both hands over her mouth as her shoulders began to shake silently. The sound she made never reached her lips. Yusuf bowed his head, one hand gripping the edge of the defense table as if the floor had shifted beneath him. The judge folded the letter carefully. This letter, he said softly, was written 3 years ago. His eyes traveled through the room. Why has no one in this courtroom seen it? Until today, no one answered. Not the officer, not the prosecutor, not the clerk. The judge's voice remained calm. That, he said, is not a mistake. That is a failure. He turned back to the officer. Officer Price, he asked, do you recall telling the interpreter to tell her father he was about to be arrested? The officer swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. You gave that threat through an 18-year-old untrained interpreter. Yes. And you understood that any misinterpretation could change the entire outcome of that encounter. Yes. There is body camera audio from that night, the judge continued. Timestamp 21:08:19. The clerk activated the recording. Static filled the room. Footsteps echoed faintly. Then the officer's recorded voice cut through the noise. Sir, step out of the vehicle now. Then Samira's recorded voice, thin, trembling. Baba, he say step out, please. Then frustration. Tell him again, louder. He is scared. He don't. Tell him he's going to be arrested right now. The audio cut. No one breathed. The judge turned back to Samira. That was you. She nodded silently. In that moment, the judge said, you were carrying more responsibility than any 18-year-old should ever be asked to carry. He turned back to the file. In your report, Officer Price, you described the defendant as hostile and non-compliant. Do you still stand by that language? The officer hesitated. Then quietly, "No, Your Honor." "What would you call it now?" The officer exhaled. "Fear. Confusion." The judge nodded slowly. "Fear can look like defiance when we are too quick to label it." Then he spoke the sentence that rewired the room. "Silence is not resistance. Fear is not guilt. And confusion is not contempt." The words hung. Samira's composure broke completely. She turned into her sleeve and cried without sound. Yusuf reached backward without turning and took his daughter's hand. The obstruction charge in this case depended on willful disobedience, the judge said. That element was compromised by a communication failure that should never have occurred. The failure to yield citation is similarly undermined. Accordingly, all charges in this matter are dismissed. He raised the gavel, then stopped. This court further orders immediate review of language access procedures for all field encounters. The use of minor interpreters shall be prohibited in all non-emergency situations. Mandatory training will be issued. The prosecutor scribbled. The officer stood motionless. "And finally," the judge said, "this court recognizes the emotional harm created by forcing a child to stand between law and fear." He turned back to Samira. "You wrote that you wanted to be a daughter again instead of a bridge. Today, the court gives that back to you." The gavel fell. Case dismissed. The gallery rose in silence. Yusuf turned fully to his daughter. "I did not know," he whispered. "I didn't want to shame you," she whispered back. "You were never shame," he said. "You were my shield." As they walked toward the exit, the judge watched them go. And for the first time in 3 years, Samira walked forward as only one thing again. A daughter. The courtroom slowly returned to movement after the gavel fell, but the feeling that lingered in the air was not routine. It was something heavier, sharper, as if a truth long buried had finally broken through the floorboards. People did not rush for the doors the way they usually did once their cases were over. They moved more cautiously, as though afraid to disturb whatever had just been acknowledged out loud. Samira and her father were halfway down the aisle when the clerk called out softly, "Miss Hamdan?" Samira turned. The clerk hesitated, then said, "The court would like you to wait a moment." Yusuf stopped beside her. His hand tightened around hers. For a brief flicker of time, fear returned to Samira's face, an instinctive reflex. She had learned 3 years ago that waiting after a police encounter rarely meant anything good. They returned to the defense table. The judge remained seated, not yet moving on to the next case. He was looking down at the old file again, as though searching for something beneath the surface of what had already been said. "Mr. Hamdan," he said at last, "after the night of that stop, did your daughter continue to interpret for you in official matters?" Yusuf lowered his head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. Doctors, school forms, immigration appointments. I did not know this hurt her." Samira's breath caught. "How long has she carried that responsibility?" "Since she learned English well enough to understand," he said quietly. "She was 14. The judge absorbed that silently. "And did anyone ever offer you a certified interpreter during those years?" "No." The room tightened again. A new layer of gravity settled over the benches. "So for 7 years," the judge said, "this young woman has been placed in the position of legal guardian, medical advocate, translator, and emotional shield for her father, without training, without support, without protection." Samira's eyes brimmed again, but she did not look away. "That," the judge said calmly, "does not appear anywhere in the official file." The prosecutor cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the city does offer interpretation services upon request." The judge lifted his hand. "Upon request," he repeated, "from people who don't know how to request what they've never been told exists." No one argued. The judge turned back to Samira. "You wrote that you were afraid to deliver that letter because you thought your father would be ashamed." She nodded. Are you still afraid of that? She hesitated, then whispered, No. Yusuf turned toward her sharply. No? He asked. She met his eyes fully now. I am tired of being afraid, she said. The judge allowed that sentence to land. The room did not breathe. Samira, the judge said, when that officer told you to tell your father he was about to be arrested, did you translate that exactly? She closed her eyes. No. What did you tell him? She struggled to speak. I told him that the officer would take him away if he moved wrong. Yusuf flinched. She nodded through tears. I made it softer. I made it less final. I was afraid if I said the word arrest, he would panic. The judge nodded slowly. So your translation saved him. She did not answer. She did not need to. The courtroom understood. The judge leaned forward slightly. The law depends on exact words, he said. And yet that night, it was a child who adjusted the truth in order to protect the man before her. That is not justice. That is survival. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Officer Price, the judge said, do you understand now why caution is required when authority is filtered through fear? Yes, Your Honor. And why the presence of an untrained minor amplifies that fear? Yes. The judge nodded once more. Then the court will expect your actions to reflect that understanding from this point forward. The officer stood silent. From the back of the room, a soft sound echoed. Someone exhaling shakily. The judge looked toward the gallery. A woman in her late 40s had risen slowly from the third row. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid. A hospital badge still clipped to her pocket caught the light. I'm sorry, she said softly. I don't mean to interrupt. The bailiff stepped forward automatically, but the judge lifted his hand. Go ahead. My name is Teresa, the woman said. I work at St. Luke's on Broad Street. I was on duty the night he was stopped. The room focused. I saw the police lights through the emergency room windows, she said. I remember thinking someone had been hurt. I didn't know it was this. She gestured gently toward Samira. I just wanted to say, she continued, voice trembling slightly. This happens in hospitals too. Children interpret for parents during surgeries, diagnoses, bad news. We let them because it's faster, because it's convenient, because the system moves too fast to slow down for language. Tears filled her eyes. And every time the child carries it. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that, he said. Teresa returned to her seat. The courtroom held a deeper silence now. Not just the silence of shock, but the silence of recognition. Samira felt as though something inside her chest were slowly unwinding, thread by thread. The judge shifted the file aside. This case has revealed something that did not appear on the surface, he said. And it is not unique. He turned slightly toward the clerk. Make note. The court will be issuing a formal recommendation to municipal agencies regarding language access beyond law enforcement, medical, housing, and public benefits. The clerk typed rapidly. The judge then addressed Samira directly one more time. You said you wanted to be his daughter again. She nodded. That does not happen in one moment, the judge said. It happens in many small ones. Today was just the first. She nodded again. Her shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. As she and her father finally stepped into the hallway outside the courtroom, the air felt colder than before, but cleaner. The noise of the building returned. Footsteps on tile, voices echoing down corridors, a distant printer churning. They stood silently for a moment near the doors. I didn't know, Yusuf said again. I know, Samira replied. I was proud of you, he said. I thought I was protecting you by letting you speak. She shook her head gently. You were protecting yourself without knowing it. He nodded. That truth hurt, but it also freed. They walked slowly toward the exit. Outside, Providence moved on as it always did. Buses exhaled clouds of diesel, tires hissed over damp pavement, delivery trucks idled at the curb. Ordinary life pressed in again, but Samira felt different inside it. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a bridge. She felt like herself. 3 weeks later, A memo circulated quietly through city departments. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced on television. But it was real. It stated, in measured bureaucratic language, that minors were no longer permitted to serve as interpreters in any municipal interaction except when immediate life-threatening circumstances made it unavoidable. It required the use of certified phone or in-person interpretation. It mandated new reporting fields for language access. It established consequences for noncompliance. Paper moved. Systems shifted. Slowly. In the same month, Officer Price attended a compulsory training seminar at headquarters. He sat in a folding chair in a room full of other officers and listened to a woman with a calm voice explain what it meant to place legal responsibility on a child. For the first time since that night in 2019, he replayed the stop in his mind with different eyes. He heard not defiance, but terror. He heard not obstruction, but confusion. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, how close he had come to changing the course of two lives permanently, not by cruelty, but by hurry. Samira returned to her university classes 2 days after court. She sat in the back row of her economics lecture with her notebook open and her pen poised. But she did not write for the first 10 minutes. She stared at the board without seeing it. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from her father. I made appointment with doctor. They said interpreter will be there. Her eyes filled again. This time she smiled as she cried. That night, she slept without dreams for the first time in years. Not nightmares, not rehearsals, just rest. The change did not arrive with press conferences or flashing cameras. It arrived quietly, folded into procedure, disguised as routine. It arrived through internal memos sent at dawn, through revised protocols attached to old ones, through mandatory briefings scheduled earlier than usual so no one could claim they didn't have time to listen. 2 weeks after the hearing, every patrol unit in the district was ordered into a small, forgotten training room at the back of a municipal building. No exceptions. No early dismissals. No excuses. Plastic chairs scraped against tile. The smell of stale coffee clung to the air. A projector hummed weakly as the first slide lit up the wall. Language is not a tool. Language is a line of power. The instructor was a woman with gray threaded through her hair and a voice so steady it commanded the room without force. She did not accuse. She did not raise her tone. She explained mechanisms, consequences. When commands are filtered through a child, she said, authority is no longer vertical. It becomes fragmented. Fear enters the communication channel before meaning does. And once fear is the interpreter, truth is already compromised. No one laughed. No one whispered. Pens did not move at first. Then slowly, one by one, officers began to write. In the third row, one man sat perfectly still. His hands rested flat on his knees. His breathing was shallow. Every sentence struck him with the dull weight of recognition. He had spent years convincing himself that what happened that night was confusion, not failure. Now, for the first time, he was being shown that it was neither. It was design. Across the city, the effects reached places the courtroom cameras would never enter. At St. Luke's Hospital, a new intake protocol went live without ceremony. Whenever a language barrier was detected, a red banner now locked the screen until a certified interpreter was connected. There was no override button anymore. No just this once. Nurses adjusted. Delays increased. Complaints followed. But the policy held. Teresa stood at triage the first evening it activated. She watched a young girl hover beside her mother, lips already parted to translate. The red banner lit up. Teresa placed a gentle hand between the girl and the counter. You don't have to, she said softly. You can sit. The girl hesitated, then slowly stepped back. Her hands were shaking, not with fear but with release. At the housing authority downtown, clerks were briefed that minors were no longer permitted to translate eviction proceedings, benefit disputes, or lease negotiations. Phone-based interpretation stations were installed at every service window. The waiting lines grew longer. Frustration followed. But children stopped standing between words that could break a family. And inside Yusuf Hamdan's world, the transformation was even quieter. The first time he entered the Immigration Services building alone after the hearing, his chest tightened before he reached the door. Habit pulled at him to search the sidewalk for his daughter. For years he had walked into these rooms with Samira already bracing the air around him. This time, the glass reflected only himself. Inside, the instructions were fast. The room was loud. For a moment, panic rose. Then the clerk pressed a button. A voice appeared in Yusuf's ear, calm, fluent, neutral. For the first time, the law spoke to him without passing through his daughter's fear first. That night, when he laid the documents across the kitchen table, Samira recognized the tremor in his hand. "They waited for me," he said softly. "They did not rush my word." She did not answer right away. After a moment, he added, "I did not know what I was asking you to carry all those years." She stared at the table. "You were asking me to survive with." His eyes lowered. "And I did not see the cost." Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not broken. Honest. In the weeks that followed, Samira noticed changes that did not announce themselves with drama. The constant readiness inside her chest softened. She started attending late study sessions without rehearsing emergency translations in her mind. She let her phone ring without immediately expecting catastrophe. One evening, she opened her laptop and stared at a blank application portal for a public policy graduate program. For years, the thought of leaving the city had felt impossible, unreachable. Not because she lacked ability, because she was tethered. Now, for the first time, the tether felt loose enough to test. 3 months after the hearing, the City Council approved a comprehensive municipal language access ordinance during a low attendance session late on a Tuesday afternoon. There were no cameras in the room, no speeches, no applause. But the ordinance changed budgets. It created oversight. It mandated enforcement. It created consequences for noncompliance. The city did not thank anyone by name. Systems rarely do. Meanwhile, the officer who had stood frozen at the training session received formal notation 6 weeks later. The document did not strip him of his badge. It restricted his autonomy. It placed him under supervised patrol. More significantly, he was required to assist in onboarding sessions for new recruits regarding language access failures. The first time he stood before a class of trainees, his voice nearly failed him. He did not mention Samira. He did not recount the letter. He spoke instead about what fear sounds like when it is misunderstood as defiance. And for the first time in his career, standing at the front of the room felt heavier than standing in any street confrontation he had ever faced. Samira spoke at her first community forum in early spring. The audience was small: volunteers, advocates, a few students. Her hands shook around the microphone at first. She did not speak about the traffic stop. She spoke about erosion. "When a child becomes the interpreter during danger," she said, "we don't grow up faster. We grow tired faster." The room fell completely still. Afterward, a teenage boy approached her quietly. "I do that for my mom," he said. She met his eyes. So did I. 6 months after the hearing, Yusuf took the written portion of his citizenship exam alone. Samira waited outside on a bench near the entrance, notebook open on her lap, pretending to read. The doors opened an hour later. Yusuf stepped out slowly. "I remembered the answers," he said. "I forgot to be afraid." 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. That night, Samira watched him practice the oath aloud in the kitchen. His voice faltered once, then steadied. She did not correct him. He corrected himself. And something ancient finally shifted places between them. Inside the courthouse, the blue envelope was no longer filed with Yusuf's citation. It had been relocated to a secure archive under a new classification: Systemic Language Access Failure, Judicial Exhibit. It was referenced once in a statewide memo. No name attached, only consequence. On the morning Yusuf took the oath of citizenship, the bus ride into the city felt longer than it had ever felt before. The street slid past the windows in slow, uneven motion. Samira sat beside him, silent, her hands folded in her lap, resisting the old reflex to prepare herself to speak in his place. When they reached the municipal building, the entrance doors opened wide with a gentle hydraulic hiss. Inside, rows of folding chairs filled the main chamber. Families clustered together, nerves visible in the way shoulders tightened and fingers interlocked. Yusuf took his seat in the front section marked for applicants. Samira moved toward the gallery. For the first time in her life, she did not follow him into a space of authority to translate what it might take from him. She followed him only with her eyes. The official at the podium spoke quietly about rights and responsibility, about participation and belonging. The words drifted through the room like steadied air. When the names were called one by one, voices rose and echoed, each declaration reshaping a life in a few syllables. When Yusuf's name was spoken, he stood. He raised his right hand. His voice did not tremble. From the gallery, Samira felt her throat close, not with fear, but with an unfamiliar surge of something that felt like arrival. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into the hallway in low murmurs and soft laughter. Strangers shook hands. Families took photographs beneath faded civic banners. A volunteer handed out small flags at the exit. Outside, the sky had settled into a pale, late-afternoon blue. On the courthouse steps, a woman passing by offered to take their photo. Yusuf stood tall. Samira stood beside him. Not in front, not behind, just beside. The camera clicked. Inside the courthouse that same afternoon, another minor case unfolded quietly in the same courtroom where Yusuf's letter had once been read. A mother stood confused at the defense table as the clerk moved through the charge sheet too quickly for her to follow. Her teenage son instinctively stepped forward. Before he could speak, the bailiff moved, placing herself with calm precision between the boy and the microphone. "Interpreter is already connected," she said. The boy stopped mid-step. And for the first time in his short life, he learned that stepping back was allowed. That moment would not be recorded anywhere official, but it would follow him. In the weeks that followed, Samira received her graduate program acceptance letter. She read it twice before believing it. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, letter resting in her hands like something fragile and dangerous. That night, she told her father. "You have to go," he said immediately. The word "have" did not sound like obligation. It sounded like permission. Preparations unfolded slowly. Books were sorted. Old notebooks were packed. The walls of her childhood room began to pale as their layers of paper and memory were peeled away. On her final night before leaving, Samira sat with her father at the kitchen table. A single lamp lit the space. The apartment was quiet in the way only familiar rooms ever become. "I kept your letter," Yusuf said suddenly. She looked up. "It was in the court file. They gave me a copy when my citizenship papers were completed." He placed the envelope gently between them. "I had not read it until last night." Her chest tightened. "I was afraid I would not deserve it," he continued. "I was wrong." She swallowed. "What did it say?" he asked. She stared at the envelope for a long moment. "That I was tired of being your voice," she said quietly, "and that I wanted to be your daughter again." He nodded. "And now you are." The words were simple. They were everything. Inside the police department, the training sessions continued. New recruits learned early that language access was not an optional courtesy. It was a procedural necessity. Field reports changed. Body cam checklists added a new line. Interpreter used, yes, no. One by one, small safeguards stacked into something that could not easily be undone. Officer Price stood through each refresher session without complaint. When his supervised period ended, his field evaluations reflected something subtle but consistent. Slower approach time, clearer pacing of commands, documented interpreter activation even when it caused delay. He never spoke publicly of the night that reshaped his understanding, but he moved differently because of it. At St. Luke's, Teresa watched a steady pattern take hold. Children who once stood frozen with responsibility now sat with coloring books in emergency room waiting areas. Parents faced systems alone, but no longer unheard. Sometimes Teresa would think of Samira in passing, in the quiet gratitude of seeing a small burden spared. On the day Samira left for graduate school, the bus pulled away from the curb in slow motion. Yusuf stood waving on the sidewalk, her scarf folded neatly around his hands to keep from dropping it. As the city receded behind her, Samira rested her forehead against the glass. She felt no guilt, only a widening horizon where duty once narrowed her world. Inside the courthouse that fall, the blue envelope remained sealed behind glass, its classification unchanged. It would never be attached to another citation. It would never be reopened as a mistake. It had become a marker, a boundary. Years later, new clerks would reference the policy without ever knowing the girl who first wrote the words. That, too, was justice. Because systems are not meant to remember people. They are meant to remember rules. And that rule would now protect children who would never know Samira's name. On a quiet winter morning 2 years after the hearing, Samira returned to the city briefly during semester break. She passed the courthouse without stopping. The building no longer pulled at her chest. Inside, another docket rolled on. Outside, the city moved with ordinary insistence. For Samira, the greatest proof of change was not the ordinance, not the policy, not the training sessions. It was the simple fact that she now walked freely into rooms where her voice belonged only to herself. And far away, in another neighborhood, a young girl sat beside her mother in a municipal office waiting room, coloring without fear, unaware of the hidden line of protection now standing quietly between her childhood and the weight of the law. If you believe no child should ever stand between authority and fear, consider subscribing to support more stories where justice corrects the system, not the child.